Blanche Monier was a French socialite who lived in the city of Poitiers during the mid-1800s. Born into an affluent family, she enjoyed a very privileged upbringing alongside her older brother Marcel. Those who knew her described her as a happy child who loved to read and was very active within her church. Her mother, Mademoiselle Monier, claimed her daughter loved religion so much that she believed she might one day become a nun and fully devote herself to the Lord. As she grew into a woman, Blanche became renowned for her beauty and attracted the attention of many male suitors, though she would never go on to marry any of them. Much to her mother and father's disapproval, she also gained a reputation for being very outspoken, particularly as a woman living in a society that was, at its core, extremely patriarchal and conservative. This caused tension within her family, and Blanche often found herself in conflict with her mother, who even family friends labeled as a tyrant who ruled her household with an iron fist. Then, suddenly between the years of 1874 and 1875, Blanche mysteriously disappeared. Rumors swirled as to what had become of the beautiful young woman, who at the time was still in her early 20s and with so much life ahead of her. Some claimed she had fallen in love with a lawyer, but her mother disapproved of the relationship and wouldn't allow her to marry him, causing Blanche to run away from her religious household and start a new life somewhere else. Others stated that her outspokenness had been a result of mental illness, and that her family had her quietly committed to a psychiatric ward far away from her hometown. As months turned to years, Blanche Monier's existence was slowly forgotten by her community, and her name quietly faded into a memory for all but a select few who knew the disturbing truth behind her disappearance. In May of 1901, a full 26 years after Blanche had gone missing, a maid who worked at the Monier residence invited her lover, a lieutenant from a local military barracks, to come and spend the evening with her. Upon arriving at the home, the soldier noticed a dreadful smell radiating from behind the door of an upstairs bedroom, and heard a disturbing wailing coming from within. His companion explained to him that behind that door was none other than Blanche Monier, the family's long-lost daughter who had been spending the last several decades almost entirely confined to that room, living in unspeakable filth and neglect. She pleaded with him to simply ignore it. The soldier's conscience, though, would not allow him to do this, and he sent an anonymous letter to the public prosecutor's office in which he wrote the following: "Monsieur Attorney General, I have the honor to inform you of an exceptionally serious occurrence. I speak of a spinster who is locked up in Madame Monier's house, half-starved and living in a putrid litter for the past 25 years. In a word, in her own filth." The name of this soldier remains unknown to this day, but his letter was enough to spur the Attorney General's office into action. The chief superintendent arrived at the Monier estate the following afternoon accompanied by 2 police officers. After getting the runaround from several servants and from Marcel Monier, who now lived in a house across the street, the inspectors were finally taken to the room in question. Upon opening the door, they were immediately overwhelmed by a horrific stench that was so terrible they could only stomach the air in the room for a few seconds. One of the officers went to open a window, but Marcel requested that he leave it shut for fear of disturbing his sister. It was then that police turned and looked to the opposite end of the room and saw this. Blanche Monier, weighing a mere 55 pounds, lied naked on a putrid straw mattress that was half rotted away, covered by an equally rotted blanket. Her hair was matted like a mangy animal, and she was surrounded by bugs and scraps of spoiled food. Her bed, which is a generous way to describe it, was covered in a grotesque film that was a combination of old food and her own bodily excrements. Blanche was terrified of the officers and let out a horrific, almost inhuman scream at the sight of them. She had been isolated in this small room, surviving off table scraps, left to urinate and defecate on herself for the better part of the last 25 years. Officers sent for help, and before long the Monier residence was crawling with police officers, doctors, and nurses who finally rescued Blanche from her dark hell. Marcel and Mademoiselle were immediately placed under arrest. Blanche's father had died 8 years earlier and therefore could not be questioned. She was taken to a local hospital where a team of doctors and nurses bathed her, fed her, and gave her clothing, with many of the medical staff shocked that she was even still alive. Upon being questioned, Mademoiselle told police that her daughter was left in such dreadful conditions because that is what she wanted, and claimed Blanche suffered from a severe case of mania that the family was unable to have treated. She swore that she hated seeing her daughter in such condition, but claimed all attempts she had made to help her had been rebuked, so the only choice the family had was to do all they could to keep her alive. Marcel backed up his mother's story, telling police his sister was deeply troubled and insisted that his parents had not held her against her will. He agreed that her living conditions were abhorrent, but supported his mother's claim that it was the way his sister preferred it. This, however, was not backed up by the evidence investigators found at the scene, nor Blanche's behavior at the hospital. According to doctors and nurses, once they had gotten Blanche calmed down, she was more than happy to be bathed and fed proper food. She had difficulty communicating with the staff and was almost childlike in her mental faculties, but every indication seemed that she was extremely relieved to be out of that horrid room. Furthermore, police found damning messages that Blanche had carved into the wall of the room she was found in. One in particular tragically read, "Make beauty, nothing of love or freedom, always solitude. One must live and die in jail all one's life." Over the next few days, several current and former employees of the Monier household came forward claiming that her imprisonment had been an open secret among the staff who worked at the home. Numerous women who'd worked the residence as servants claimed they would often try to enter the room to give her fresh linen, bathe her, and change the covers on her mattress, but that Mademoiselle would not allow it. Supposedly, while Blanche's father was alive, he would make it a point to not allow his daughter's living conditions to become so dire. But since his death, she had fallen into extreme neglect on her mother's watch. These witnesses were also split as to whether Blanche's confinement had been voluntary or not. Some backed up the family's claim that she suffered from psychiatric problems and that she had voluntarily locked herself away from the outside world. Others disputed this and told heart-wrenching stories of hearing Blanche's cries from behind the door, begging for someone to come and rescue her, though tragically, none who heard her pleas had the courage to act. As far as her parents' motive for keeping her confined, the only theory ever put forward was a claim that supposedly before her disappearance, Blanche had become pregnant with a child outside of wedlock with a man whom she had no interest in marrying. This brought great shame to her extremely religious parents, who paid to have her pregnancy terminated, then locked her away in her room as a form of punishment. Though it should be stressed, this was never confirmed to be true. When newspapers caught wind of the story and revealed it to the public, they were outraged. A large mob formed outside the Monier house chanting for Marcel and Mademoiselle to be taken to the gallows and hung for what they had done. Mademoiselle subsequently became ill and passed away just 2 weeks later, long before she could be brought to trial. Marcel was taken to trial. However, the court found him mentally unfit, and after appeal he was acquitted, with the judge placing the lion's share of the blame on Mademoiselle and her late husband. As far as Blanche was concerned, doctors were optimistic she could recover, at least initially, but those hopes would quickly fade. Reading the Wikipedia article and several of the blogs that have covered this story, you would think she suffered from a whole host of mental illnesses for the rest of her life, with those sources going so far as to say she was diagnosed with schizophrenia, anorexia, exhibitionism, and corophilia, which do yourself a favor and don't Google the meaning of that last one. However, contemporary sources at least seem to dispute this assessment. French author André Gide wrote an article detailing the case in 1930, for which he was granted access to the original documents filed by the Poitiers Attorney General's office, as well as case overviews by doctors who had treated Blanche. According to this information, Blanche had reacclimated herself to life outside of that room fairly quickly. She was quite happy to eat real food again, gaining close to 50 pounds in the months following her rescue. And far from being an exhibitionist, hospital staff described her as quite modest and timid. They said Blanche did have issues with going to the bathroom on herself, as it had been what she was accustomed to doing for so many years, but had relearned to use a chamber pot within a couple of months. Where she struggled heavily, though, was socializing and communication. Doctors described her as very childlike. She would often speak in riddles, give ridiculous answers to even the most basic questions, and broke into spells of laughter seemingly at random. She was also prone to fits of anger, especially when asked about details on her captivity. So much so that when her brother was brought to trial, police were unable to provide a statement from her to the court because she couldn't give a coherent answer to anything they asked. Her brother claimed this sort of behavior was common before she was locked away, arguing that it was proof of her mental illness, which, to be clear, would in no way justify what her family had done to her, but nothing during her time before captivity seemed to support the notion she was mentally unwell. She was a well-read student who succeeded in school and had a robust social life, with her primary sin being that she had started to rebel against her religious parents and acted out in a manner they did not approve of, which, for context, was behavior that would often get young women unjustly committed to psychiatric wards, but that's a discussion for a different video. The greater point here is that it seems during her time in almost total isolation, Blanche's mental faculties had substantially regressed. Despite doctors at the time doing the best they could to try and help her, they eventually realized that she would likely never be able to live on her own and care for herself, and diagnosed her as clinically insane. She would spend the remainder of her life in a psychiatric hospital, where she would die in 1913 at 64 years old. Isolation and how it affects humans both mentally and physically is something that has been explored by researchers for decades and remains hotly discussed to this very day. We are, of course, a social species, and one of the most important aspects of developing and maintaining a healthy brain is having social interaction with other human beings. And the things that happen to us when that is taken away have proven to be both equally fascinating and horrific. From a physical standpoint, the effects of long-term isolation have been shown to increase chances of stroke or heart attack by a degree on par with smoking and obesity. It has also been shown to lead to loss of appetite, which consequently leads to substantial weight loss, an increased chance of heart disease, and, well, let me just leave a list on the screen as opposed to naming off every single thing. It is for this very reason that the practice of solitary confinement has become so controversial among psychiatrists. Solitary confinement, or restrictive housing as the penal system usually refers to it, is the practice of locking a prisoner away in a cell for upwards of 22 hours a day. This is often utilized on prisoners who have been uncooperative, have been caught with paraphernalia, or have become hostile towards guards and other inmates. It is considered an effective means of punishment for inmates who have broken the rules. However, a significant portion of the psychiatric community argues that its use constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. The United Nations echoed this sentiment and in 2015 called on its member states to ban the practice entirely. Now, I'm well aware the subject of ethical treatment of prisoners, particularly those who have committed heinous crimes, is always a dicey one. As someone who has extensively covered some of the worst humanity has to offer, I get the visceral instinct to inflict as much suffering on them as possible. However, I think we can all agree that when it comes to punishment of criminals, there is a line in the sand at some point. I doubt many of us would support a return to things like drawing and quartering or crucifixion, for example. If not for ethical reasons, then at the very least practical ones, considering the justice system regularly makes mistakes or is taken advantage of by those with nefarious intent. Take, for example, Nelson Mandela, who was regularly subjected to solitary confinement during his 27 years as a political prisoner, and in his autobiography remarked, Quote, "I found solitary confinement the most forbidding aspect of prison life. There was no end and no beginning. There was only one's own mind, which can begin to play tricks." The U.S. whistleblower Chelsea Manning was also subjected to solitary confinement for 8 months during her time in federal prison, a fact that became a rallying cry for those who advocated for her release. Solitary Watch, a watchdog group that advocates against the practice and collects data on solitary confinement, also reported that it is often used against prisoners who report mistreatment by prison officials, and that in many instances, the threat of solitary confinement is used to prevent inmates from reporting on corruption within the prison system. Despite widespread condemnation from the psychiatric community, though, solitary confinement is still regularly utilized in prisons all across the United States. As many as 80,000 prisoners were believed to have been subjected to the practice over the course of 2021, and the reported psychological effects were haunting to say the least. This phenomenon is so well documented that in 1993, Dr. Stuart Grassane dubbed it SHU syndrome, which he characterized by hypersensitivity to external stimuli, hallucinations, panic attacks, cognitive deficiencies, obsessive thinking, paranoia, and a litany of other physical and psychological problems. And again, even if you have zero sympathy for this sort of treatment being deployed against someone like Anders Breivik, the Norwegian mass murderer who killed 77 people in a politically motivated bombing and shooting spree in 2011, you have to recognize the downfall of allowing such treatment to take place, particularly when it can be used by corrupt prison officials or against people who are unjustly incarcerated. Solitary confinement is basically a button that can be pressed to psychologically destroy someone. And even if that button is often pressed against criminals you feel deserve it, we need to ask ourselves if this is a tool we should be putting in the hands of a flawed justice system run by flawed and corruptible human beings. Everything we've talked about here is the effect of isolation on grown adults with fully developed brains and social skills. But what happens when someone is subjected to extensive isolation from the moment they are born and never able to develop any of these faculties? Sadly, that is a question for which we have an answer. In October of 1970, police in Los Angeles, California received a phone call from a city social worker. A woman named Irene Wiley had entered their office that morning accompanied by her daughter Genie. Irene, who was almost completely blind, had come to apply for welfare assistance and had mistakenly entered the wrong office. Workers immediately noticed Genie and could tell something was off. She had this strange walk to her that they described as a, quote, bunny walk. She didn't speak to anyone in the office and communicated with her mother using only grunts and snarls. She even groomed herself in a manner that a dog or a cat would, licking her arms and rubbing her wrists against her face. Upon first looking at Genie, they believed her to be no more than 8 years old, but were shocked to find out from her mother that she was actually 13. She was incredibly malnourished, appeared to have not properly bathed in some time, and still required the use of a diaper. Her and her mother were taken into police custody, where Irene revealed a horrific tale. She claimed that she and her daughter had been living under the tyranny of her abusive husband, John, who would regularly beat both Irene and Genie. It was then that she also revealed the most disturbing detail of all. From the age of just 20 months old, Genie had spent the majority of her life locked inside of a room by her father, never allowed to go outside, have friends, play games, or any of the comforts that so many of us consider just a normal part of childhood. As a result, Genie had never learned to talk or socialize the way most other people do. Her disturbing bunny walk was a result of never being nurtured and taught to walk like a normal child, and her animalistic grunts were due to never being taught verbal communication. In fact, it was theorized by investigators that anytime Genie attempted to verbally communicate with her father, she was beaten and developed her strange speaking habits as a result. She had lived entirely on a diet of baby food and milk, which had led her to be extremely physically underdeveloped, making her roughly the size of an 8-year-old despite the fact she was a teenager. Irene insisted she had been an unwilling participant and basically was held hostage by her husband, but the state of California was skeptical. Irene was placed under arrest for child abuse, and an arrest warrant for John was issued later that day. As police dug deeper into the Wiley home, the true horror of Genie's captivity was revealed to them. They found a homemade straitjacket that she would be forced into and then strapped to a child toilet when she had to use the bathroom, meaning she had never developed basic bladder control or had been taught how to use the bathroom on her own. Her father had even covered her bed with a large metal cage to prevent her from getting up until she was allowed to. Doctors who examined her at the hospital said it was the worst case of child abuse they had ever witnessed. Genie's father would go on to commit suicide before he could be brought to trial, and charges against her mother were dropped after police determined that she had also been a victim of James. Genie was placed in foster care, but providing the young girl with treatment proved to be an uphill battle. Doctors struggled to communicate with her. She couldn't read or write and couldn't verbalize, only speaking through growls, barks, and grunts. She would use objects such as chairs and cups to make noise in attempts to communicate as well, but this was the extent of her ability. Her case quickly gained national attention, with the media giving her the rather crude name of the, quote, feral child. Psychologists and researchers who specialized in psychology flocked to the case hoping to work with Genie. Though she would never learn to speak a primary language, she did begin making strides in her communication ability and had developed enough to understand and hold something resembling a conversation with her doctors. However, after Genie turned 18, custody of her was signed back over to Irene, who, without warning, cut doctors off from speaking with her, believing they were less concerned with Genie as a person and more concerned with fulfilling their own scientific curiosity. As of the most recent news, which was in 2008, Genie once again lives as a ward of the state of California and is still unable to communicate. Now 65 years old, it is likely she will require care for the rest of her life. The human mind may be able to endure extreme hardships, but from Blanche Monier to Genie to every prisoner locked away in solitary confinement, there clearly seems to be something about isolation that breaks us in a way few other things can. As a group, we can survive almost insurmountable odds, but it seems that the one thing that is almost unrivaled in its ability to destroy us is being alone.